Hey guys, tonight we're going back in time to Tudor England, a world of chamber pots, wooden teeth, and questionable decisions made by candlelight. But more specifically, we're diving into the everyday reality of intimacy back then. Spoiler alert, it wasn't romantic, it wasn't steamy, and it absolutely wasn't something you'd read about in a swoony period drama. In fact, between the lack of hygiene, total lack of privacy, and the ever-present threat of religious guilt, it's a miracle anyone even tried while you think you've had a bad date. Try sharing a straw mattress with your extended family, a couple of live chickens, and a highly opinionated rat named Herbert. That's just Tuesday in 1535. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love hearing who's nodding off to my voice across the globe. Dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together while you lie back, the ceiling above you slanting slightly. The roof leaks. Always has. The mattress beneath you is stuffed with straw, or it was, until most of it flattened into a kind of itchy burlap pancake. You're not alone. Oh no, not even close to in your left, your uncle snores like a medieval accordion. On your right, your cousin, who has taken exactly one bath since Whitsun. At the foot of the bed, a small dog that isn't yours, but now refuses to leave. Above you in the rafters, chickens, and somewhere just under the bed frame, that rat again. You name him Herbert because it makes you feel better. Herbert stares at you in the dark. Judging. Welcome to bedtime in Tudor England. Beds are scarce, space even scarcer, and the concept of personal time hasn't been invented yet. People sleep in shits, sometimes fully clothed, and usually huddled together for warmth. This isn't some quaint communal experience. It's because firewood is expensive. Insulation doesn't exist, and if you don't share body heat, you'll freeze. There's no bedroom door, no privacy screen, just a heavy curtain if you're lucky. Otherwise, it's open plan misery all night long. Every cough, snore, or awkward movement is shared with the room. And trust me, everyone hears everything. You want to try anything remotely romantic? Good luck doing it with your brother-in-law grunting 3 feet away and a baby teething on your boot. Historians still argue whether wealthier Tudor homes offered more intimacy in their sleeping quarters. Some had private chambers, yes, but even then, servants might sleep on the floor, and walls were thin enough to make eavesdropping practically a sport. Don't even think about nighttime distractions. No book lights, no podcasts, no quiet scrolling. Just darkness. Candlelight's a luxury, and you'd rather not burn the whole house down just to read by fire. So you lie there, stiff as a corpse, trying not to breathe too loudly while you can't shift without waking someone. You can't whisper without someone asking if you're summoning the devil. You can't do much of anything without getting a strongly worded glare from at least 2 relatives and possibly the DO. Just also talk about those beds themselves. They're often just sacks of straw on wooden frames, sometimes no frame at all. Bugs? Oh, so many. Bedbugs, fleas, lice, all your closest companions. You scratch 1 itch, 5 more appear. One theory goes that hanging bed curtains wasn't just for warmth or modesty, it was to keep out the insects falling from the thatched ceiling. Charming while you lie awake, itchy, freezing, with a leg cramp and someone's foot on your face. This is where the term sleep tight supposedly comes from, ropes beneath the mattress that needed tightening to avoid sagging like a collapsed flawn. Of course, if those ropes snapped, down you went. Possibly on top of the chamber pot. Yes, the chamber pot. The elegant Tudor solution to midnight bathroom needs, tucked politely beneath the bed. It's used by everyone, then sloshed out the window in the morning with a hopeful guards low. If you're on the ground floor, so intimacy any kind isn't just unappealing here. It's logistically impossible. The setting is about as mood-killing as a tax audit. And yet, somehow, people persisted. They whispered, they snuck. They prayed the kids were asleep, they weren't. They tried, against all odds, to find moments of connection between the straw and the snoring and the sound of Herbert dragging a stolen sock into a shadowy corner. There's no such thing as date night. There's no soft music, no scented candles, unless you count tallow dripping onto your elbow and the sound of your mother-in-law mumbling a song. This is how the night stretches on. Long, cold, cramped, loud. With every tick of the imaginary clock, you wonder how anyone ever managed to make babies in Tudor England. And then remember, most people didn't have the choice. Love, passion, attraction, optional extras. Survival? Not so much. To still, you lie there, sandwiched in history, trying not to breathe in the foot fumes wafting from the end of the bed, and think, maybe tomorrow will be cleaner, or at least quieter. But probably not. Morning breaks not with birdsong, but with someone sneezing directly into your ear. You jolt upright, smacking your head on a low beam. The chickens above you flutter in disapproval. Somewhere, Herbert the rat scurries triumphantly toward the oats. Another day in Tudor England has begun, and you still smell like last week's laundry. Well, you stumble toward the wash basin, a cracked ceramic bowl, and a jug of cold, suspiciously gritty water. This is your bath. No hot water, no soap unless someone's been extra lucky, and no privacy. You splash your face, immediately regretting the decision. It's like washing with medieval lemonade. Soap, if you even have it, is usually homemade, some mixture of animal fat, ashes, and lye that smells like boiled leather and burns your eyes. If it foams, you're probably hallucinating. Bathing isn't just inconvenient, it's considered downright dangerous by many. The Tudor logic goes like this. Warm water opens the pores, and that lets disease sneak in. So, best to stay dry and crusty. You're welcome. Historians still argue whether this fear of bathing was universally held or just exaggerated by modern interpretations. What's clear, though, is that most people bathe maybe a few times a year. You're lucky if you get a wash before Christmas, so you make do with dry washing, scraping off sweat and dirt with a cloth and pretending your armpits don't exist. Everyone around you is doing the same. It's not that you're the odd one out. The whole village smells like pickled feet and cabbage, and yet, somehow, you're expected to be attractive in all this. Let's say you're married, or at least betrothed, or situationally entangled. Either way, your partner also smells like livestock and wears the same linen shirt for weeks at a time. There's hay in their hair, a mysterious stain on their knee, and something green wedged in their molars. Romantic. No reality? Why is that? Even the clothing situation doesn't help. Layers upon layers, wool, linen, lacing belts. By the time you've gotten undressed, the candle's out, the fire's out, and possibly your will to live is also out. And good luck undressing discreetly. Remember, you're still in a one-room home with family members tucked into every crevice like human drawer organizers. The act of disrobing becomes a logistical challenge worthy of its own sonnet. The most bath-like experience you're likely to have is a trip to the public bathhouse, if you live near one, and if it's not recently closed due to plague, moral outrage, or someone trying to sell leeches out of the foot tub. These bathhouses were communal, rowdy, and often multi-purpose. Sometimes they doubled as brothels, which didn't help their already suspect reputation. Eventually, bathhouses were outright banned in many places due to their association with sin and disease. Because nothing says public health like making everyone smell worse to compensate for the lack of actual cleanliness. People got creative. Perfume sachets worn in your clothing, pomanders filled with cloves and dried herbs, and even aromatic gloves, all attempts to hide what lurked beneath. There's even one tale of a Tudor noblewoman who kept slices of citrus fruit stuffed in her corset to mask body odor. Apparently, nothing says "kiss me" like fermented orange cleavage. And when it came to teeth, oh dear, toothbrushes weren't common. Instead, you might rub your gums with cloth, chew aromatic twigs, or rinse with vinegar and salt. Mint? Ha! That's for nobles. You, however, just accept that your breath smells like old fish and prayer. And still, you're expected to participate in the rituals of courtship, marriage, or marital duties. You just have to pretend everyone's stench is charming, or at least survivable. This is where clothing does some heavy lifting, literally. Your best chance at a lure is a new chemise, freshly aired hose, and maybe a bit of rosemary rubbed behind the ears, if you can find some. If not, maybe just try not to stand downwind. By midday, the sweat's soaked through anyway. Your sleeves are crusted with grime. The soles of your feet feel like smoked ham. You catch a glimpse of yourself in a shiny pewter plate and think, well, it could be worse. Then you remember the neighbor who fell into a dung pit last week, and you nod. Yes, it could be worse. Historians still debate how much poor hygiene actually affected attraction in Tudor times. After all, if everyone smells, no one really notices. But it's also likely that wealthier people, those who could afford imported soaps, scented oils, and multiple changes of clothing, were seen as much more desirable. Surprise! Money makes you smell better, but you try not to let that thought ruin your day. You go back to the basin and splash more gritty water onto your face. It trickles down your neck and into your shirt, where it immediately chills and clings like judgment. While you shiver. It's only day 2 of the week, and already you're dreaming of a hot bath you'll never have, soap that doesn't sting, and a bed that isn't shared with extended relatives and small rodents. But for now. You take one long sniff of rosemary, pinch your nose, and head out the door into another gloriously unwashed day. By mid-morning, you're hauling firewood up a muddy path while silently reflecting on a few key truths of Tudor life. Everything smells, nothing is private, and sex is a sin unless the church says otherwise. That's not an exaggeration, it's official policy. Your love life is being spiritually supervised. While you pause to wipe sweat from your brow, not that it helps. The sweat just makes the dirt cling harder. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls, not for a service, but because someone, somewhere, is probably sinning. You included. While you see, the church doesn't just frown at premarital fun. It practically throws a full-scale liturgical tantrum. There are rules, lists, long, ink-stained scrolls dictating what can and cannot be done, when, how often, and at what angles, though that last part is more whispered than written. The logic is this. Intimacy exists for one purpose, making babies. God-fearing, tax-paying, potentially plagued surviving babies. Anything else? Suspicious at best. Historians still argue whether this restrictive view was enforced equally among all classes, or if wealthy nobles slipped by with more impunity. But one thing's clear. For most ordinary people, fear and guilt were part of the bedtime routine. For instance, Mondays? Technically fine. Tuesdays? Also fine. But Wednesdays? Better think twice. Fridays? Absolutely not. It's the day Christ died, remember? Sundays? God's watching. Saturdays? Risky, depending on local interpretation. Add in feast days, fast days, Lent, Advent, and about 150 saint commemorations, and suddenly you've got a calendar where spontaneity is punishable by eternal fire. And heaven help you if you're within 3 degrees of consanguinity. That means you can't marry or do much else with anyone closer than a second cousin. But with villages being as small and gossipy as they are, avoiding your cousins is easier said than done. It's like trying to find someone on Tinder with no mutual friends. while your priest is reading your messages out loud. Confession is a key part of it all. Imagine marching to your local church, kneeling, and explaining to the village priest, in graphic detail, that you once kissed your wife's ankle on a Thursday. The priest sighs, scribbles something in Latin, tells you to say 7 Hail Marys and maybe sprinkle holy water on your trousers. Forgiveness achieved. Mostly, there's even a well-documented list of forbidden positions, which reads less like the Kama Sutra and more like a bureaucratic fever dream. Anything that deviates from the missionary model is considered suspect. And while priests may not be in your bedroom physically, their rules definitely are, wrapped in parchment, draped in incense, and judging you from the corner. Of course, the wealthy often skirt around these regulations. Henry VIII, famously, has his own list of exceptions. 6 wives, numerous mistresses, and enough romantic scandals to fuel an entire modern tabloid industry. The rest of you? You can't even wink on a Wednesday. Still, people tear-wide if they sneak glances in the market square. They flirt over spilled grain sacks. They whisper behind barrels. And they hope, desperately, that the parish priest didn't see them holding hands during the Michaelmas feast. The problem is, the church has eyes everywhere. Monks, nuns, friars, and nosy neighbors make up an unofficial surveillance state powered by piety and baked goods. Got caught kissing in the orchard? Expect a sermon. Accidentally said something flirty during Mass? Prepare to scrub the altar with your own tears. One infamous priest manual advised clergy to ask specific, intrusive questions during confession. Questions that would make a modern therapist ask, "Sorry, are you okay?" And these weren't theoretical. They were used, especially on women, whose morality was policed like royal treasure. Quirky side note. If you managed to follow all the rules and still conceive a child out of wedlock, the punishment varied. Sometimes you had to do public penance barefoot in the town square. Other times, you were just fined and quietly married off to the father, assuming he didn't skip town with your goat. So why go through all this trouble? Because the consequences of being labeled sinful were very real. Social disgrace, economic hardship, and spiritual dread weren't abstract ideas. They were your daily reality. You didn't just worry about disappointing your parents. You worried about burning forever because you couldn't resist temptation on a Thursday. And yet, here you are, sneaking a smile at the brewer's apprentice, who is, if you're being honest, completely worth damnation while you return home that evening, weary and muddied, and light a single candle. You think about the rules. You think about the sermons. And you think about whether anyone in this entire country has ever had a genuinely good time in bed without immediately regretting it. Probably in a beauty then again. Maybe that's what makes it all the more thrilling, the brief moment between guilt and gloom, when you forget the calendar and the clergy, and just laugh with someone in the dark until, of course, you remember that tomorrow's a saint's day and you've just invalidated your own soul again. Oops. The sun's barely risen, but your neighbor is already arguing with her husband over whether dried onions or wild turnip mash makes a better love potion. You sigh. It's going to be one of those days, because despite the church's blanket ban on almost anything resembling joy, Tudor folk were still wildly inventive when it came to love, lust, and the illusion of control over both. Enter homegrown aphrodisiacs, love charms, sex spells, romance recipes written in the margins of cookbooks. Welcome to the produce aisle of forbidden desire. While you walk through the village market, trying not to laugh at the peddler hawking snail shell powder, guaranteed to stir the loins, mend the heart, and silence your mother-in-law. He's not alone. Another booth is selling rose petal vinegar for marital courage, whatever that means, while an old woman mutters prayers over a jar of goose fat labeled for the warming of relations. You decide not to ask. Historians still argue whether these folk remedies were genuinely believed to work or were simply tolerated as hopeful superstition. Either way, they were popular. And sometimes alarming. Take the love apple, for example, an early name for the tomato. It was rare, exotic, and thought to be both dangerous and seductive. You couldn't even serve it casually without someone raising an eyebrow and accusing you of seduction by a salad. Other favorites included roasted parsnip, symbolic. Unfortunately, dried frog powder, very symbolic. And, on one particularly bold recipe scroll, a potion made with mashed ants, honey, and grated bone. You read that one twice, just to be sure. Nope. Still ants. And then there's the classic. The charm tucked in your lover's shoe. A few strands of your hair, some rosemary, and a whispered spell tied in linen and placed under the insole. It's supposed to make them dream only of you. More often, it just gave them blisters and confusion. The logic behind these concoctions was shaky at best. For example, eating a turnip baked under a full moon might open the body to Venus, while tucking a red ribbon in your corset would ensure vigorous pursuits. There's no evidence any of this worked, but it gave people hope, and sometimes an excuse when things went strangely wrong, while you yourself once accepted a cake from a neighbor's daughter who had very obviously carved your initials into it using a chicken bone. You ate it anyway, and then had food poisoning for 3 days. Romance, it wasn't just women casting charms either. Men, too, tried their hand at faux chemistry. One recipe for stirring the passions of a maiden included nutmeg, milk, and the breath of a blacksmith, which raises more questions than answers that these concoctions weren't always harmless. Some included belladonna, mandrake, or henbane, plants with actual psychoactive or toxic effects. People didn't always know the line between herbal wisdom and accidental poison, but they were desperate for control in a world where marriage was arranged, sex was regulated, and desire was seen as dangerous. Sometimes, these charms were more social performance than practical tool. You'd whisper about your potion in the marketplace. Others would lean in, giggle, and ask for your recipe. You'd hint that it came from your great-aunt's grimoire. Everyone played along. The performance was half the point. But there were darker sides. If someone accused you of using these potions maliciously, or worse, of witchcraft, things could get ugly fast. You'd be hauled in front of a local magistrate, asked questions with no good answers, and possibly imprisoned or publicly shamed. One too many love spells gone wrong, and suddenly your romantic blend becomes evidence of a demonic pact. One story in your village still makes the rounds. A woman who allegedly buried a rooster's foot under her neighbor's doorstep to cause infertility. Whether it worked or not is unclear, but the woman moved away shortly after. Probably wise. Historians still debate how much of this magic belief system bled into official medical practice. Some physicians of the day, the few who didn't think sneezing was caused by demons, still prescribed aphrodisiacs rooted in the same folk logic. Eat oysters, they said. Sleep under hawthorn, they added. Rub rabbit brains on your feet, they occasionally whispered. Questionably, even midwives sometimes doubled as herbalists and charm keepers. If you needed help conceiving or avoiding conception, they were your quiet allies. They might not have had formal training, but they had recipes, and sometimes those recipes included goose feathers and moon phases. If you didn't ask too many questions, you might even get results. You step into the manor kitchen, wiping mud from your boots and ducking under a beam so low it's practically daring you to get a concussion. The cook hands you a mug of something warmish, possibly beer, possibly turnip water. Best not to ask, and you settle into the corner near the fire. Across the room, someone singing a love ballad to a broom. Romance is thriving in its own deeply strange way. Let's pull back for a moment and ask a basic question. Why did people even marry in Tudor England? Was it for love? For companionship? For someone to braid your hair while you weep softly into a leak? No, it was mostly for property. Marriage was a transaction, a contract, a neatly folded agreement between families to merge land, labor, and livestock. You, dear listener, are not a fluttering heart with dreams of moonlit dances. You're an asset. You're either being exchanged for a dowry or acquiring one, and either way, love has very little to do with it. Especially if you're a woman. Women were legally subordinate to their husbands the moment the wedding vows were muttered. Their property became his, their wages, if any, went to him, and their legal identity blurred into a charming historical fog called coverture. You couldn't own much. You couldn't sue. In many ways, you couldn't exist outside your husband's shadow. Historians still argue whether affection grew naturally over time in these arranged unions or whether people simply resigned themselves to tolerance. The surviving letters and court records offer glimpses of tenderness, but also plenty of complaints about goats, snoring, and infidelity involving pie vendors. Picture yourself on your wedding day. You're 15, maybe 16. If you're a noble, you're wearing layers of stiff embroidered fabric that itch like punishment. If you're a peasant, your wedding tunic was probably worn by your aunt's aunt, and possibly the family cow once during a harvest play. You don't know your spouse very well. Maybe not at all. But the priest says the words, you say, I do, and suddenly you're someone's legal partner, expected to produce heirs, manage a household, and die quietly of childbirth or gout. Whichever comes first, there's no honeymoon, no tropical getaway. Your bridal suite is probably the same bed you shared last week with 3 cousins and an elderly goose named Oswald. But now you're married, so technically, any awkward fumbling under the sheets is holy. Emotionally scarring, but holy. And what a passion. What a fire-eyed glances across a feast table. That's for the bards. In reality, passion was seen as suspicious, something that clouded reason. Marrying for love? Dangerous. Marrying for lust? Blasphemous. You marry for grain, for sheep, for alliances that will stop your uncle from stabbing your other uncle over a fence dispute. Marriage contracts often listed what the bride was bringing: acreage, animals, maybe a copper pan if she was lucky. The husband, in turn, provided protection and the promise of a stable roof. Not necessarily affection, definitely not shared hobbies. If you both happened to like onions, that was just a bonus. One infamous court record describes a woman suing for annulment because her husband refused to speak to her for 3 years. She lived in the same house as him, cooked his meals, cleaned his clothes, and he never uttered a word. The court was unsure whether this counted as cruelty or extreme introversion. Even the wedding night was steeped in legal symbolism. In some regions, it wasn't considered official unless witnessed by others. Yes, really. Occasionally, attendants would literally stand outside the door and listen, cheering at the creak of the mattress like it was a joust. One French noble couple had their consummation signed off by the archbishop. Nothing says romance like papal documentation. And speaking of performance, let's not forget the role of fertility. The entire point of this arrangement was to produce children, preferably male, definitely many, and ideally without dying in the process. If you failed to produce offspring within a reasonable time, the gossip would start. Maybe he's cursed. Maybe she's barren. Maybe they just can't figure out which end goes where. To help, you'd be given fertility advice. Some from the church, pray more. Some from neighbors, drink nettle tea while walking backward. And some from your mother-in-law, maybe stop looking so smug all the time. None of it helped, but everyone had opinions. And if your marriage soured? Too bad. Divorce was nearly impossible unless you were royalty or had a particularly vivid dream involving St. Cuthbert giving you legal advice. Most couples just stuck it out, or quietly took lovers, or slept in separate haylofts and blamed the weather to still. Not all marriages were miserable. Some grew into affectionate partnerships. Others were at least functional. A few were even happy, though this often surprised everyone involved. The key, perhaps, was lowered expectations and mutual respect, or simply accepting that life is hard, love is harder. And if you both enjoy boiled cabbage, you've already beaten the odds while you lean back against the kitchen wall, sipping your possibly turnip beverage, and watch as someone tries to flirt by handing a girl a goose feather and winking. She rolls her eyes. He trips over a cat. The dance continues, because even in a system where marriage is property, passion is policed, and intimacy is bureaucratized, people still try. They scribble sonnets. They pluck wildflowers. They sneak glances in market stalls. Hope springs eternal. Even when the mattress squeaks, the room smells like old ale, and your dowry includes 3 goats and a wheelbarrow with 1 wheel. You're sweeping ashes from the hearth when the midwife bursts through the door, apron flapping, cheeks pink, muttering something about another poor soul with a backwards baby and no patience. She doesn't stop to explain. She never does. You just nod, wide-eyed, and return to your very important task of pretending you weren't eavesdropping. Because if there's one thing that truly defines sex in Tudor England, besides the smell, the guilt, and the complete lack of cushioning, it's the terrifying, omnipresent reality of childbirth while you were expected to have children. Lots of them, whether you wanted to or not. Whether your body could handle it or not. Whether you understood how reproduction actually worked or not. And the truth is, most people didn't. Historians still argue whether Tudor women had a deep cultural understanding of reproductive health passed down through folk knowledge, or whether it was mostly confused whispers, old wives' tales, and sheer guesswork. Based on the advice floating around, it's probably a bit of both. For instance, many believed that if a woman looked at a rabbit during pregnancy, her child might be born with long ears, or that craving sweets meant you were carrying a girl, while a craving for salty things meant a boy, or that too much laughter could dislodge the baby, which sounds like a very elaborate excuse for being grumpy all the time in OW. Imagine being pregnant in this world. There's no prenatal care, no ultrasounds, no vitamins. Your diet is whatever happens to be in the pantry, dried peas, questionable ale, and the occasional piece of salted fish. Your mattress is lumpy, your feet are swollen, and the midwife keeps saying things like, if the stars align, it'll be quick. You try not to ask what not aligning means. When the time comes, you're ushered into a dark, stifling room known as the birthing chamber. The windows are covered. The men are banished. Only women are allowed in, your mother, your sisters, your neighbors, and the midwife. Sometimes the local herbalist. Occasionally a chicken. Possibly for moral support, this room is hot. Not by accident, but by design. It's believed that warmth helps bring the baby faster and keeps evil spirits from entering. So, the fire blazes. The windows stay sealed. You sweat like a cheese wheel in August and pray that the midwife, experienced but not always trained in the way we'd recognize, uses time-honored methods. Herbal compresses, whispered prayers, maybe a strong drink. No anesthetics, no sterile gloves. Just linen cloths, wooden tools, and centuries of collected guesswork. And one important item, the birth girdle. It's a long, narrow piece of parchment or cloth, often covered in prayers and saintly images, that's wrapped around the mother's belly to provide spiritual protection. Because when science runs out, you turn to God, and then probably to Jen. If things go well, the baby arrives pink, squalling, and immediately wrapped in swaddling bands so tight they resemble a very angry loaf of bread. If things don't go well, you don't talk about it. Childbirth was dangerous. Hugely so. For both mother and child. Estimates suggest that as many as 1 in 3 women might die from complications during childbirth or shortly after, due to hemorrhage, infection, or sheer exhaustion. Entire generations lived knowing that giving life often came with the risk of losing your OWN. Indeed, didn't end there. If you survived the delivery, you entered a period of churching, a formal purification ceremony held about a month later. The church didn't exactly say you were unclean, but it did strongly imply it by making you stand at the church door until the priest waved you back in like a misbehaving goat. Meanwhile, your baby had to be baptized immediately, often within hours of birth, because if it died before baptism, well, purgatory awaited, or worse. The midwife might even perform an emergency baptism herself, just in case, using water from the wash basin if no priest was around. A grim insurance policy against eternal damnation. And what of the father? Well, he was usually pacing outside, asking useless questions like, "Is it over yet?" Or, "Do we have any fresh bread?" He'd celebrate with ale, maybe name the child after himself, and then go back to his normal duties until the next baby came. And the next. And the next. You were expected to bounce back quickly. There's no maternity leave when you're a peasant. Within days, you're sweeping, cooking, hauling water, and possibly pregnant again. You try not to think about it. You try not to cry every time the baby wakes up wailing at 3 in the morning with colic, or teething, or existential dread. You do your best. Sometimes the baby thrives. Sometimes it doesn't. Child mortality was heartbreakingly common. You try not to name them too soon. You try not to get too attached before the christening. But you always do. Of course you do. One woman in your village had 12 children. Only 5 survived to adulthood. No one calls her unlucky. They call her blessed. Because 5 is more than most, while you sit by the hearth, listening to the midwife clatter about in the next room. You sip weak beer and stare into the fire. It's the only warm spot in the house. A baby cries upstairs. A rooster crows at something only it can see. You wonder how many women throughout history have done this exact thing. Waited, worried, hoped, and you wonder how many of them, in moments of exhaustion, ever looked up at the low rafters and muttered, "You know what? Maybe celibacy isn't so bad after all." You're trudging through ankle-deep mud on your way to the baker's stall, and you overhear 2 older men having a very loud, very serious argument over whether it's appropriate to wash your underthings more than once a month. You don't stop walking, but you do quietly reconsider every romantic impulse you've ever had, because here's the thing no one puts in love ballads or stained glass windows. Tudor hygiene was an absolute romance killer. Let's start with the basics. Baths were rare, not haha, I'm lazy rare, more like, my doctor said water causes plague, rare. Many people believe that soaking your skin opened the pores, which in turn allowed disease to crawl in and set up shop. So, obviously, you avoid that at all costs. Cleanliness? A health hazard. Welcome to Tudor science. Historians still argue whether the upper classes bathed more often than the poor, or just covered their funk with more expensive perfumes and extra ruffles. Either way, deodorant didn't exist and people developed creative coping strategies like stuffing lavender into your sleeves, or hanging dried herbs from your belt to disguise the armpit stew wafting beneath your doublet, or carrying a pomander, a decorative ball filled with sweet-smelling spices like a medieval air freshener you can angrily wave at your neighbor during church. And don't even get started on laundry. The clothes were bulky, layered, and hard to clean. So you just didn't. Your outer garments might be brushed or aired out occasionally, but your underlayers? That linen shift you sleep, sweat, and live in? If it made it to a wash tub more than once every few weeks, it was considered pampered. You picture seduction in this world. Picture undressing in a drafty cottage, piece by piece, revealing layers of scratchy fabric until you get to the grand finale. A pair of woolen hose and underpants that smell like old soup and bad decisions. Romance. And yet, somehow, people still found each other attractive. Maybe because standards were lower. Maybe because you couldn't smell your own stench. Maybe because if everyone smells like goat, no one does. You step into the bakery, greeted by the soothing scent of burnt flour and yesterday's regrets. The baker flirts by offering you the crusty end of a barley loaf. You're not sure what that means, romantically, but you take it anyway. Teeth, meanwhile, were their own tragedy. Dental hygiene was minimal. Toothbrushes weren't widely used yet. At best, you might rub your teeth with a cloth or chew a twig. Cavities were common. Rotten breath even more so. Kissing was sometimes avoided, not out of shyness, but survival instinct. One fringe belief claimed that kissing could swap souls, or at least personality traits. So if you kissed someone particularly foolish, you might suddenly start misplacing your tools and forgetting your prayers. That's not love. That's spiritual cross-contamination. Hair care wasn't much better. Lice were a fact of life. Fleas, too. Women often wore linen coifs to keep their hair cleanish and hidden, while men might shave their heads under their hats to limit infestation. Combs were prized tools. If you had one without teeth missing, you were practically royalty. And yet, for all this effort, people still styled their hair to impress. Women braided, curled, or wore elaborate headpieces. Men used bear grease to slick down their hair. It worked, sort of, but also left them smelling like they'd lost a fight with a sausage. Then there's the makeup. That pasty, ghostly white face you see in portraits. Healthier people had tans, and tans meant you worked outside, and working outside meant you were poor. So, bring on the slow poisoning. Rouge was made from crushed beetles or mercury-laced mixtures. Eyebrows were sometimes shaved off entirely, only to be redrawn with soot. That smudge you find charming? It might be powdered mouse fur. You do your best not to think about it, and yet, in the candlelight, filtered through a haze of beeswax smoke and hopeful imagination, someone might still call you beautiful. You might blush, which is good. It proves you're alive, and they might lean closer despite the risk. Because even in a world of sweat, soot, and suspicious pustules, love finds a way. Or at least, proximity finds a way. Sex itself, in these conditions, required a certain level of fortitude. You needed to ignore the fleas, the damp straw mattress, and the fact that someone was probably praying for your soul just a few feet away. Privacy was rare. Curtains were a luxury. And if your grandmother lived in the same one-room cottage, you just hoped she was asleep, or at least hard of hearing. Quirky detail. Some newlyweds tied bells to the bedpost so everyone would know the deed was done. Others hung their bedsheets out the window as proof. Today, that would be oversharing. Back then, it was proof of fertility, pride, and maybe a little bit of showing off. Look, we followed all 17 church guidelines and got a stain. Still, most people didn't advertise. Most just tried to get through it without sneezing, cramping, or knocking over the single candle lighting the room. Nothing kills the mood faster than a hay mattress on fire, or you leave the bakery with your crusty loaf and a new understanding of what passes for charm. Across the village square, someone's playing a lute badly. A couple strolls past, fingers barely touching. She's wearing wilted daisies in her hair. He has a visible lice comb in his HA. It's a mess, beauty, it's their mess, and somehow, amidst the grime, the sweat, and the cabbage-scented air, people still fall in love. Or something close enough. You wake to the distant toll of the church bell and the much closer sound of someone outside dramatically vomiting into a hedge. Probably Reginald. Probably the meat again. You roll over, pull the scratchy wool blanket tighter, and sigh. Because today, like every other day in Tudor England, is ruled by a force more powerful than love, lust, or even lice. The church, from the moment you're born, drenched, squalling, and wrapped like a badly folded burrito, the church is in charge. Baptism within hours. Confirmation not long after. And marriage? Oh, don't even think about doing that without a priest and at least 2 witnesses who aren't asleep. The church doesn't just have opinions about sex, it has rules. Pages of them. Scrolls full of them. Entire sermons devoted to reminding you that your body is a sinful, lust-hungry disaster just waiting to trip you straight into damnation. Historians still argue whether the average Tudor truly internalized all this guilt or just smiled, nodded, and went back to their goat-flavored flirtations. But the result was the same. You were always being watched. If not by your priest, then by your neighbors. If not by your neighbors, then definitely by God. And his heavenly minions had nothing better to do to say you're married. Great. You're now permitted, within very strict parameters, to engage in sex with your spouse. But not on Sundays, or Fridays, or during Lent, or Advent, or Easter week, or any time you're about to go on a pilgrimage, or when there's thunder, or if one of you has a festering boil in an ominous location, and even when it was allowed, it was supposed to be subdued, reverent, focused entirely on procreation. Enjoying yourself too much? Dangerous. Trying something creative? Risky. Trying something twice? Downright heretical. One confessional guide instructed priests to ask married parishioners whether they had ever performed the act face to face more than once in a day, or attempted it in a spirit of levity. Levity, it seems, was a spiritual crime. Curious about what counted as a sin? You didn't have to be. The local priest was happy to let you know. So was the town crier, the local midwife, and probably the man who sells eels out of a cart. Gossip and guilt went hand-in-hand. But let's say you weren't married. Now you're in real trouble. Fornication, adultery, and even impure thoughts were punishable offenses. Public shaming was common. You might be made to sit in the front pew during Mass wearing a special cloak of shame, or paraded through the town square holding a sign that said something like "fleshly sinner" in bold, judgmental lettering. Not great for your romantic prospects. Still, people tried to get around it. Courting couples sometimes developed elaborate codes. A tap on the wrist meant, "Meet me behind the sheep pen." A woven ribbon might say, "I'm interested, but only if you have your own turnip field." You get creative. Church, meanwhile, tried to keep up. They banned dancing, condemned lewd songs, and burned books with improper illustrations, by which they meant anything with a visible ankle or a suggestive-looking zucchini. And don't even ask about theater. Theatrical performances were constantly under suspicion. Too many double entendres. Too much giggling. One particularly notorious morality play was shut down because the actor playing lust got too many cheers from the audience. Can't have that. Then there were the confessionals. You'd kneel, mumble your sins into a dark wooden box, and hope the priest didn't recognize your voice. Which he did. Always. You confessed to lustful inclinations and temptations of the flesh, and he sighed deeply and assigned you penance. A prayer, a pilgrimage, maybe abstaining from bread for a week. Nothing too harsh, unless you were a repeat offender. Then it got serious. One woman was sentenced to 3 years of widowhood-style mourning just for getting caught with the fishmonger. Oh, you start to notice that people live double lives. By day, obedient, devout, straight-laced. By night, sneaking out windows, passing notes, humming naughty ballads under their breath. The taverns are full of whispers and heavy flirting. The church knows, but it also knows it can't police everyone. Quirky detail. One of the most frequently whispered confessions involved dreams. People would apologize for things they dreamed about, fearing that their subconscious alone could damn them. There's a recorded case of a man doing penance for dreaming about a woman holding a sausage. Not even doing anything with it, just holding it. You can't make this up. Still, the church did offer one strange, secret benefit. Forbidden romance is oddly thrilling while you catch someone's eye during a service. You accidentally brush hands during a communal meal. You offer them the last hunk of bread without speaking. And suddenly, the moment is electric. You're alive. You're rebellious. You're both pretending that the entire weight of divine judgment isn't hanging over your heads like a judgmental chandelier. There were even rumors of priests and monks themselves engaging in secret liaisons, proof that no one, not even the most holy, was immune to temptation. One local tale tells of a nun who ran away with a stable boy and was later caught trying to re-enter the convent by pretending to be her own ghost. She failed, but you have to admire the commitment. Of course, there were consequences, sometimes brutal ones, but still, people pushed the line. Because love and lust don't care much for liturgical calendars or canon law. Step back out into the chilly air. The sun is rising through a patch of fog, making the chapel windows glow like molten honey. A bell rings in the distance. Someone drops a basket of onions. Life goes on. You button your tunic, straighten your cap, and try not to think impure thoughts. It works for about 12 seconds until you spot the girl from the baker's stall leaning against a fence, eating a pear like it's a loaded weapon. Sigh. Forgive me, Father. You're sitting on a three-legged stool in the corner of the tavern, watching someone try, and fail, to play a lute with more than 2 working strings. A man nearby is telling a story about a woman who supposedly seduced a bishop by baking bread in the shape of his face. No one believes it, but everyone listens. Because rumors about sex in Tudor England? That's where things really get weird. There were rules, yes. Church regulations, social expectations, personal hygiene disasters. But what really shaped people's understanding of sex, especially for those without access to books or tutors, were folk tales and street gossip. These were your sex ed, your relationship advice columns, and your tabloid headlines, all rolled into one ale-soaked story passed from mouth to mouth. One of the most enduring myths, that a woman could control conception with her thoughts. If she didn't enjoy it, many believed she couldn't conceive, which, as you can imagine, opened up all kinds of awkward legal and moral debates. Historians still argue whether this was genuinely believed or just an excuse used by clever women, and their defense of, then there were magical contraceptives. Not potions, exactly. More like charms. You might tie a string of toad bones around your waist, or wear a pouch of dried herbs under your skirts. One common recipe called for powdered stag horn mixed with wine. Another suggested walking backwards while spitting over your shoulder after intimacy. You start to realize that early modern science was mostly just creative choreography. If you were desperate, and many were, there were the so-called womb amulets, carved wooden tokens inscribed with prayers and little drawings of angels, worn like necklaces, believed to keep you from getting pregnant, or from dying in childbirth, or from attracting the wrong kind of lover. The one who talks about himself too much and never helps churn butter. These weren't just village tales. Even the educated elite dabbled in them. One nobleman reportedly hired an astrologer to determine the safest night to consummate his marriage without conceiving a daughter. The stars were consulted. The moon was observed. The result? 4 daughters, indeed. Then there's aphrodisiacs. If you lived in Tudor England and were feeling, shall we say, romantically uninspired, you might try any number of culinary enhancements. Parsnips were considered mildly exciting. So were onions. Eggs, especially soft-boiled, were considered ideal preparation food. And oysters? Definitely on the list, if you could afford them. But the real stars of the Tudor spice rack were more adventurous. Powdered snail shells, roasted hedgehog meat, wine boiled with nettles. A surprisingly popular love potion involved dried beetles, mashed figs, and the hair of a red-headed virgin. Whether it worked or not, no one asked twice. You sip your ale slowly, grateful that tonight's brew tastes more like barley than pond. The innkeeper's daughter winks at a traveler from Dover, who promptly spills his drink and trips over his own boots. Smooth dot. There were also plenty of whispered theories about physical traits and what they supposedly revealed about one's passions. A man with thick eyebrows? Clearly lustful. A woman with a gap between her front teeth? Infamous lover. Red hair? Dangerous. Broad hips? Fertile. Long fingers? Untrustworthy. Dimples? Witch. Of course, none of this was based on anything remotely factual. But in a world without reliable medicine, streetlights, or privacy, people became masters of symbol reading. Every glance, every gesture, every weird mole was assigned meaning. One of the strangest beliefs? That if two people sneezed at the same time, they were meant to be. You kind of wish that one were true. It would at least make allergy season more interesting. And don't forget the dream interpretations. If you dreamed of water, it meant temptation. If the water was muddy, it meant sin. If you dreamed of climbing stairs, you were ambitious, but dreaming of falling down them meant you were doomed to lust. Dreaming of shoes? Someone was stepping out on you. Dreaming of bread? Well, that depended heavily on how crusty it was. These myths weren't just entertainment. They shaped real decisions. Who to marry, when to get married, whether you should marry at all, or join a convent and just keep your dreams of hedgehog-based love potions to yourself. Then there was the flip side. Cautionary tales, traveling bard who wooed a widow and was cursed with hiccups until death. The milkmaid who flirted with a noble and found herself waking up in Spain. The priest's son who kissed a goose. Don't ask. All stories told to warn, to titillate, and to remind you that sex, especially the fun kind, came with consequences. Quirky detail. In some villages, they'd bury a rooster's feather in front of your door if they suspected you of sleeping around. Subtle? No effective? Also no. But it gave people something to giggle about during Lent. Still, behind all the winks and warnings was a simple truth. People were curious about how bodies worked. Curious about how love felt. Curious about whether passion could survive in a world of muddy roads, damp beds, and prayers about fire and brimstone consequences. You watch the inn fill with smoke and laughter. A man begins juggling apples. A woman laughs too loudly. Someone starts singing about a fisherman and a mermaid and a very confusing encounter near a well. You can't help but smile. Because even in a world ruled by myths, shame, and stale parsnips, people still looked for connection. Still made each other blush. Still whispered stories in the dark, wondering which ones might be true. Maybe some were. Maybe they weren't, but they were all part of the dance. You wake up before dawn, wrapped in a blanket that smells faintly of smoke, wool, and possibly the stable. The room is dim, the fire just embers now, and you can hear the town slowly creaking to life. Someone coughing, chickens squabbling, a dog barking at absolutely nothing. Another day begins in Tudor England, and you're bracing for the part of romance no one writes sonnets about. Getting caught, in a time when almost everything, your marriage, your birth, your leftovers, was someone else's business. Sneaking around was less a thrilling game and more a high-stakes act of survival. Being exposed for engaging in any sort of illicit intimacy, be it with the wrong person, the wrong timing, or just too much enthusiasm, could ruin your life in a matter of hours, while you pull on your stockings as you think of the neighbor girl, Matilda, who only last month was caught sneaking out of the miller's house. She claimed she was borrowing flour. No one believed her. The gossip spread like wildfire, and she now carries a new nickname, Mistress Muffin. You're not sure if that's more insulting to her or to baked goods in general. What makes it worse is that accusation alone is often enough. You don't need witnesses, just a rumor, a bad look, the wrong person in the wrong doorway, a slightly messed up bedspread. Suddenly, the parish constable is involved, your parents are yelling, and your plans for a quiet life of candlelit flirtations are over. Historians still argue whether these social codes were harsher for women than men, or if men simply got away with more because the system was built by, well, men. Either way, One misstep, and you could go from charming flirt to moral cautionary tale before the next bell tolled. The punishments? Let's just say romantic discretion was strongly incentivized. If you were unmarried and caught inappropriately, you could be fined, excommunicated, or paraded through town wearing a humiliating sign. For nobles, scandal could mean losing titles or being forced into unwanted marriages to clean up the mess. For the poor, it could mean losing your job, your home, or your tiny shred of dignity if you were already married and caught with someone else. That's when things got especially dicey. The church courts might haul you in for questioning. You'd be asked questions like, did you touch hands more than once? Or did you share a bed without a chaperone? Or did your lips rest upon theirs longer than the time it takes to say an Ave Maria? No joke. They actually time kisses. Then you might be punished with public confession, fines, or worse yet, a mandatory separation. If you were lucky, they'd just make you sit in church wearing a white robe while someone read your sins aloud like a scandalous shopping list. Quirky detail. In some parts of Tudor England, adulterers were forced to stand at the church door with a rope around their necks and a cake of soap in their mouths. Symbolism? Yes. Hygienic? Debatable. Not all punishments were public. Some were quiet. Subtle. You'd be blacklisted from trades, excluded from festivals, looked at sideways in the marketplace. The social freeze-out was often more brutal than a public flogging, and far longer lasting. And that's if you were a commoner. If you were noble, the rules got messier, more dangerous. Court scandals had a habit of exploding. A mistress caught out of favor might find herself married off to some ancient baron in the north. A man suspected of stepping too close to a lady in waiting might end up reassigned to Ireland, a place so unpopular at court it was basically exile with sheep. You think about a story you once heard. A stable boy and a lady's maid, deeply in love, meeting behind the stables at midnight. They were caught. The boy was whipped and sent away. The girl was forced to kneel before her entire household and recite the 10 Commandments until her voice broke. No one ever saw them together again. That story ends quietly. Most do. Because scandal in this world is like smoke. It creeps under doors, clings to everything, and never really goes away while you finish dressing and head outside. It's cold and damp, and your breath fogs in the morning air. A group of children are playing with sticks. One of them pretends to be a priest, another a confessor, and the third, apparently, a woman accused of wicked desires. They're all 7. You shake your head and walk over them, and yet, even with the danger, people still took the risk. Still passed folded notes. Still lingered near doorways. Still found ways to meet, however briefly, in kitchens, barns, behind hedgerows, or in church pews under the pretense of discussing psalms. There's something inescapably human about it, this need to connect, to touch, to love, even when everything around you says not to. Maybe that's why people did it. Maybe love, made dangerous, becomes more thrilling. Maybe lust, made forbidden, tastes sweeter. Or maybe, just maybe, they were all lonely and cold and tired of talking about pickled herring while you glance up at the sky. It's pale and clouded, as usual. A bird flutters overhead. Somewhere, bells begin to ring, calling people to prayer or work, or maybe just into another day of pretending that everything is fine while you breathe deeply, adjust your hood, and carry on and trying, as always, to keep your heart out of trouble. You're hauling water from the village well, your hands already raw from the cold rope, when the midwife waddles past muttering about someone's unsanctioned encounter behind the cheese cart. You try not to look guilty. Because in Tudor England, sex didn't just come with shame and scolding, it came with surprises. And by surprises, of course, we mean pregnancy. Pregnancy, back then, wasn't framed in glowing metaphors or adorable booties. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and socially explosive. If you were married, it was your solemn duty. If you weren't, it was a disaster wrapped in gossip and stuffed in a linen smock that ended the way. It was an ordeal to Ellie to say you're a married woman, and you've just realized your usual symptoms, sore feet, mild irritation, a craving for gooseberries, have taken a turn. You're late. Your body aches in new and unfamiliar ways. Congratulations, you're probably pregnant, and your life is about to become a circus of discomfort, ritual, and wildly outdated advice. First off, forget privacy. Your entire household, your neighbors, and probably the town alewife will know before you do. A swollen belly becomes a public event. People start touching you without asking, offering unsolicited predictions about the baby's gender based on whether you're waddling more to the left or the right. Mainstream fact. Tudor women often relied on wise women or midwives, not doctors. Physicians were expensive and, frankly, a little too into bleeding people for everything from nosebleeds to childbirth. Midwives, though, had herbs, experience, and about 50 stories that all began with, well, once there was this girl from Dunwich. But what if you weren't married? Now we get into the scandalous kind of swelling. An unmarried pregnant woman was basically social dynamite. Even if she whispered that it was the result of true love and sweet intentions, the judgment would fall like a dropped chamber pot. A child born out of wedlock was called a bastard, and that wasn't just rude, it was a legal status with real consequences. Limited inheritance, fewer rights, and a life branded with whispers and awkward silences. The mother? Well, she might face public penance, fines, or even jail. In some cases, she'd be made to stand at the church door during services, belly visible, shame fully weaponized. A few towns even had scold's bridles, metal contraptions placed over the heads of women deemed too loose-lipped or lustful. Imagine trying to flirt while wearing a helmet with a mouth clamp. Historians still argue whether these punishments were actually common or mostly symbolic. But the fear they inspired? Very, very real. Even childbirth itself was an unpredictable beast. Without modern medicine, the chances of things going wrong were high. Women often gave birth squatting, gripping wooden bars or ropes, surrounded by a group of other women who would sing, chant, or recite psalms while occasionally arguing about how many candles were too many. Quirky detail. One Tudor superstition held that if a cat jumped over a pregnant woman's belly, the child would be born cross-eyed. Another warned against letting your shadow fall across the cradle before birth. It could stunt the child's spirit. You find yourself nervously avoiding sunlit doorways, just in case, during labor, the father was rarely present. Instead, he'd pace anxiously outside or down several pints at the tavern in a well-practiced panic. If the baby was born healthy, he might be summoned to hold it, briefly, before it was whisked away for emergency christening. Infant mortality was high, and they weren't taking chances. Baptism within hours was often the goal, especially if the baby seemed frail. If the child survived, big if. You then faced the curious phase of lying in. This meant about a month of bed rest, visitors, warm drinks, and no housework. Sounds lovely. Except it was also a time full of spiritual dread and whispered prayers. People feared that childbirth had left the mother unclean, and she couldn't attend church again until she was churched, a blessing ceremony where she was essentially re-welcomed into society, body and soul. Then came the naming. Names weren't just cute, they were strategic. You might name the child after a saint to earn divine favor, or after a relative, hoping for inheritance, or after a monarch, just in case they got famous later and you wanted to brag about being first. Regardless of the name, the child's birth would follow them forever. A legitimate child could rise in the world. An illegitimate one likely stuck. Unless, of course, they got lucky. Rumors were always swirling about secret noble bastards raised in monasteries or royal gardeners who were really hidden princes. You don't know if they're true, but you want to believe one of them was. Back in your present moment, you pass by a narrow alley and hear a whispered conversation. An anxious girl asking her friend whether missing her bleeding means she's cursed. The friend hesitates, then says she should eat a boiled crow's egg, just in case. You keep walking, silently sending them both well wishes and the hope of better advice. For all the hardship, though, pregnancy also brought community. Women helped one another. Families adapted. Even nosy neighbors would often bring soups and cloth scraps. Babies were swaddled, sung to, rocked to sleep with lullabies that haven't changed much in 500 years. And somehow, in a world where pregnancy was terrifying, dangerous, and sometimes life-ending, people still kept having babies because in the end, love, clumsy, inconvenient, muddy love, finds a way. Whether in marriage, behind a cheese cart, or in a stolen moment near the goose pens, indeed the babies. They grow up. They toddle through courtyards. They chase chickens. They ask impossible questions. They remind you that even in Tudor England, life, like love, refuses to be stopped. The wind picks up as you make your way down a muddy lane, dodging the contents of someone's chamber pot that's been unceremoniously dumped from a second-story window. You duck just in time, because if there's one thing Tudor England loves more than its gossip and pies, it's rules, and right now, you're thinking about all the ones that governed how people were supposed to behave in bed. Spoiler, they're both very specific and completely unenforceable. Yes, we're talking about the manuals at NOT of the illustrated variety, sadly. These were handbooks of conduct, morality sermons, and medical tracts written by men, often very celibate men, about what married couples could and couldn't do under the sheets. And friends, the rules were more detailed than a royal tapestry and at least twice as itchy. First off, positions. Missionary was encouraged. Anything else? Strongly discouraged, if not outright declared a sin. Why? Because the missionary position supposedly mirrored the natural order of things, man above, woman below, both staring solemnly into the abyss of duty. The church saw intimacy as something to be endured, not enjoyed. As one popular Tudor sermon put it, the bed is but a tool of obedience to God's multiplication. Sexy, right? Historians still argue whether these prescriptions were actually followed, or if couples simply nodded during church and then got experimental once the candles were blown out. There's no medieval version of Dear Diary detailing what actually went on. But let's just say human nature has a reputation. Second, timing. While you were not allowed to do it on Sundays, during Lent, during Advent, during feast days, on fast days, on the eve of communion, or if you had recently engaged in any other intense spiritual reflection. That ruled out roughly 200 days a year. You begin to understand why so many Tudor families had 7 children. The remaining 165 days must have been busy. Then came frequency. According to one moralist, twice a week was acceptable. 3 times was pushing it. 4 meant you needed to go to confession immediately and perhaps lie face down in a field until your urges passed. Third, intention. Pleasure alone was frowned upon. Every act was supposed to be directed toward procreation, not recreation. If a married couple were enjoying each other too much, their souls were considered in danger. Enjoying your spouse? Suspicious. Complimenting their body? Worldly. Laughing afterward? Definitely a sin. This leads you to the absolutely bonkers belief that sex during daylight hours was inherently more sinful than at night. The logic. The darkness was more modest, which is objectively hilarious, considering how dark Tudor houses already were. You could be sitting next to your spouse and not recognize them until they sneezed. Quirky detail. There were pamphlets that warned men not to linger too long in the embrace for fear that spirits would attach to them mid-act. Literal spirits. You weren't just risking divine wrath, you might accidentally summon a ghost. That's one way to kill the mood. Still, people weren't oblivious. Most villagers, merchants, and even minor nobles understood that these guides were aspirational at best. Like medieval Pinterest boards, They looked great in theory, but collapsed the moment real life entered the room. That didn't stop authorities from trying to enforce them, though there are court records of couples being reprimanded for overexuberance. What did that mean? Nobody's sure, but the phrase shows up a lot. There's even a documented case of a woman accusing her husband of sinful noises during intimacy. He was fined. The noise were never described, or you passed by a wooden post nailed with a notice from the local bishop, reminding citizens to remain chaste in mind and temperate in body. You wonder how many people read that on their way to the tavern, shrugged, and ordered another round of ale, because for all the rules, people found workarounds. They coded their desires into songs, into letters, into symbolic gifts. A pomegranate might mean passion, a carved spoon, fidelity, a shoe left outside your door, a complicated invitation that depended entirely on whose shoe it was. Hopefully not Reginald's again. Even among the clergy, those sworn to celibacy, the tension was real. Rumors of monks having special friends, of nuns giving birth and claiming miraculous conception, circulated constantly. A particularly juicy tale involves a friar caught sneaking out of the convent kitchen with flour on his robe and lipstick on his tonsure. You try to imagine that arrest report while you stop in front of the apothecary's window. Inside, bundles of herbs hang from the ceiling: sage, fennel, lavender. You recognize some of them from whispered recipes for passion-calming potions. Many couples, especially those trying to stay in good standing with the church, would buy calming teas meant to reduce desire. Spoiler, they didn't work, but they gave people plausible deniability, and sometimes there was enough. And yet, for all the restrictions and risk, there's something oddly charming about how creative people geoed two lovers meeting in the orchard, pretending to inspect the apples. A wife gifting her husband an embroidered handkerchief with suggestive stitching only he could decipher. A tavern singer slipping the name of her sweetheart into a ballad when no one was paying attention. This quiet rebellion, this insistence on affection despite all odds, gives you a tiny surge of warmth, like the sun finally poking through a rain cloud. Even in a world where pleasure was policed and romance was regulated, people still found ways to love each other, and occasionally make sinful noise while doing so. You're passing a small churchyard, early morning mist curling between crooked headstones, when you hear the distinct sound of someone loudly repenting. Again, it's just old Thomas, who's made a weekly ritual of confessing the same vague sin involving butter, a widow, and God's mercy. No one really asks questions. But it gets you thinking about something even the Tudors couldn't ignore. What happens when it all goes terribly, awkwardly wrong? Tonight, we're in the realm of bedroom disasters. And no, we don't mean clumsy furniture or creaky floorboards. We mean the kind of, oh no, what have I done, moments that Tudor life turned into spiritual, medical, and often public crises. LEDs say things didn't go according to plan. You've just had a romantic encounter within the rules, or sort of adjacent to them, and now your partner has fallen ill. Or you have. Or both of you. In Tudor minds, the culprit wasn't germs, which they didn't understand yet. It was imbalanced humors. That's right. You were probably too full of black bile. Or maybe your spleen was jealous that sexual failure or excess was considered medically dangerous. For men, too much intimacy could allegedly dry out the brain. For women, not enough was said to cause uterine suffocation. That's not a joke. Doctors genuinely feared wandering womb syndrome, where the uterus supposedly floated around the body looking for something to do. If left idle, it could apparently strangle you from the inside. Historians still argue whether this diagnosis was metaphorical, hysterical, or just the result of a very long afternoon with no better explanations. But the treatments were even more dramatic. Women were sometimes prescribed strong-smelling herbs like rue and mint, or even encouraged to hold slices of roasted onion near their belly buttons. You can't decide which is worse, the smell or the dignity lost. And then, of course, There were the accidental confessions that people caught in compromising situations sometimes claimed they'd been possessed. One poor man in Sussex claimed he'd been hexed into loving a local barmaid. He even blamed her pie. Another insisted that a demon had led him to kiss a nun with intent to bless. That didn't go over well. He was assigned 80 days of penance and a new haircut that made him look like a frightened mushroom while you keep walking past a bakery where someone scrawled "slut cake" in flour on the back wall. Subtle? Not at all. But effective in spreading public shame? Oh, absolutely. If you were accused, rightly or wrongly, of loose conduct, people didn't whisper. They carved it into bread, into fence posts, into songs. Reputation wasn't just social, it was physical. It followed you on every wall, and it didn't just stop at gossip. The law had a say. TOO, if your marriage wasn't, shall we say, fulfilling, you could bring your spouse before the ecclesiastical courts. That's right, bedroom complaints could become legal proceedings. There are records of wives claiming their husbands were inadequate and men countering that their wives received too coldly. These weren't metaphors. They were courtroom testimonies, often very detailed ones. One hilarious and tragic case involved a man who tried to prove his virility in court by dropping his pants and dramatically flexing. The judge fainted. No, really quirky detail. In one case, a husband tried to annul his marriage by claiming his wife had deceived him. He thought she had 3 teeth, but after the wedding, he discovered she only had 1. Somehow, this was connected to her, lacking allure. The court did not side with him, but they did recommend he eat more soup. Then there were the bed tests. In particularly scandalous cases, couples would be asked to lie in bed together, fully clothed, while witnesses observed whether they interacted warmly. You imagine sitting on the edge of a straw mattress while 5 parish elders judge your marital chemistry like it's a Tudor version of Love Island. The pressure must have been unimaginable. A&D when things got even more tangled. Infidelity, hidden pregnancies, or child disputes, there was often an official called a matrimonial inquisitor who came in to investigate. Sounds terrifying, doesn't it? A man with a large hat and a clipboard asking questions like, "And when, precisely, did the apple pie cool enough for lying down?" All of this makes modern awkward relationships look like polite tea parties. Beauty, the deeper truth behind these tales? People were trying, awkwardly and often hilariously, to make sense of their relationships with the limited tools they had. No therapy, no privacy, no scented candles. Just church doctrine, barley wine, and the occasional angry goose. Yet, despite the social minefield, people continued to flirt, to write clumsy love poems, to sneak glances in church, to pretend to talk about weather when they were really asking, "Are you free tonight after prayers?" Because that's the thing about intimacy, it survives. Even when the rules are absurd. Even when the whole village is watching. Even when onions are considered medical instruments, while you round the corner and see an older couple laughing. She's brushing flour from his shoulder. He's pretending not to like it. And you realize not everything went wrong. Sometimes things went right, quietly, stubbornly, even sweetly. Not every love story ended in a trial or an onion bath. Some just lasted. You slow your pace near the riverbank, where ducks float unbothered, and 2 boys argue over whether eel skin can really be used as a love charm. It's peaceful here, almost enough to forget that, not too long ago, a royal decree banned lewd songs about the Queen's virtue. Because when it comes to Tudor intimacy, nothing was safe, not even jokes. Tonight, you're wandering into the surprisingly spicy world of Tudor-era innuendo, comedy, and coded talk, how people spoke about sex without actually saying it, especially when they couldn't risk saying it at in an age of relentless surveillance, by church, by neighbors, by your own mother. Innuendo became a survival language. People joked, flirted, and even insulted each other using metaphors so tangled they'd make Shakespeare blush. Actually, scratch that, Shakespeare invented half of them. Mainstream fact? The bard himself was a fan of sneaky double meanings. Country matters, he'd write with a wink. Die as a euphemism, plucking roses. And let's not forget Hamlet's infamous line to Ophelia. Do you think I meant country matters? Delivered with the kind of pause that made audiences smirk and Puritans squirm. But Shakespeare wasn't alone. Everyday folk spoke in layers. If someone said you had a fine orchard, they probably weren't talking about apples. If a boy offered you his turnip, it might not be for stew. The world was bursting with vegetable-based euphemisms, and historians still argue whether this was intentional or just the result of very limited metaphors and way too many parsnips. Quirky tidbit. In some towns, especially around spring festivals like May Day, locals composed body rhymes on the spot, riddles that often started innocent and then took a hard turn into innuendo. One classic, I have a staff, I tap it thrice, I make the ladies smile so nice. You get the picture. And if you don't, consider yourself lucky. Even fashion played a part. Codpieces, yes, the infamous padded flap over men's nether regions, were more than just weird armor for your groin. They were a statement, sometimes even a joke. Some were embroidered with verses, painted with flowers, or stuffed to frankly ridiculous proportions. There is one record of a noble's codpiece being so large it required a support strap. Functional? No. Memorable? Absolutely. The ladies, meanwhile, had their own sly cues. A slightly loosened bodice at the Mayfair, an invitation, a red ribbon tied just above the ankle, entirely innocent, unless you tied it twice. Historians debate the accuracy of these fashion codes, but it's likely many gestures worked on local rumor and mutual suspicion. You might not know exactly what it meant, but you didn't want to be the only one who didn't. You walk past a tavern now, where a bard is tuning his lute and rehearsing a verse about a milkmaid's jug. It's probably not about dairy. A small audience has already gathered, giggling into their trenchers. In all of this, you see a world that needed laughter, not just to flirt, but to survive. Rules around sex were rigid. The consequences were often life-altering, but through jokes, songs, riddles, and well-placed vegetables, people found a release valve. Humor made it bearable, made it communal, made it human. Even court jesters got in on it. They were allowed to say things others couldn't, mocking nobles for their weak swords or ill-aimed arrows. Their job was to push boundaries with a grin. In fact, some of the best preserved Tudor dirty jokes come not from the brothels, but from court entertainers who walked a fine line between comedy and treason. Every day. Of course, not everyone was amused. The church issued sermons against sinful mirth, and pamphlets circulated warning that jesting with impure intent could lead the soul directly to ruin. But did that stop anyone? Not really. If anything, it made the joke spicier. It's amazing how funny a riddle becomes when someone tries to ban it while you stop under a tree and spot something carved into the bark. A heart, a pair of initials, and, curiously, a turnip. Maybe a joke, maybe a memory. Either way, it's a reminder that love and laughter lived on trees, lips, and laundry lines. Historians still argue whether this widespread innuendo culture was truly understood by all or if it functioned like an inside joke, where some got it and others just nervously laughed along. But one thing's certain, people always found a way to speak the unspeakable through riddles, through rhyme, through eyebrow-raising vegetable poetry. You move on, passing a man balancing a lute, a jug of ale, and what appears to be a nervous chicken. You don't ask, and you can't help but smile as you think, maybe humor was their real love language. Not poetry, not gifts, not even the occasional onion-based medical ritual, but just laughter in the face of rules. Flirtation hidden in jokes and tenderness dressed up as turnips. The wind has shifted now, warmer, softer, laced with the scent of wood smoke and something sweet wafting from a baker's hearth. You follow it instinctively, boots scuffing along cobblestone. It's the end of the road tonight, and with it comes one final curiosity. What happens to desire once youth has passed? The rules have been endured, and reputations are no longer up for debate. Yes, we're talking about Tudor relationships in their later years, how passion aged in a world obsessed with chastity, lineage, and lingering suspicion while you imagine you're older now. The silver at your temples isn't from powdered wigs, but from the honest wear of time. Your joints creak when you kneel for prayers. The village kids stop calling you sir or miss and instead go with that old one by the well. You don't mind. They're mostly right. But what happens when you still want companionship? Warmth? Someone to laugh with after the chickens are fed? In Tudor England, older couples rarely divorced, partly because the church made it nearly impossible, and partly because by the time your third child had survived the measles and your roof stopped leaking, the idea of breaking up just seemed exhausting. Instead, marriages settled into something calmer. Not passionless, but slower. Sleepier. You might no longer sneak kisses behind the hay cart, but you might share your last plum tart without grumbling. That's love, TOO. Mainstream fact. Widows and widowers were legally allowed to remarry, but there was always suspicion. A man who remarried too fast after his wife's passing might be whispered about. A woman who seemed too keen on a second husband, definitely raising eyebrows. Lustful widow was practically a Tudor genre while it happened. In fact, many second marriages were genuinely affectionate. With the business of inheritance settled and children mostly grown, older couples often found a kind of freedom the young never had. They weren't expected to reproduce. They could walk together without people calculating birth dates. They could, imagine this, flirt for FU in a YOU stroll by a house where candlelight flickers through a cracked shutter. Inside, a gray-bearded man is braiding his wife's hair. She's laughing. You can't hear what he said, but whatever it was, she swatted him with a grin. Quirky detail. Some Tudor love letters between older spouses still survive, and they're shockingly sweet. Not fiery or dramatic, but full of tiny observations. The way you warm the bread, how you scratch behind my ear without asking, that your snore has become a comfort. It makes you wonder how many long marriages were secretly, stubbornly romantic. It wasn't all lace and lute songs. The body changed. Medicine didn't help much. Herbalists might suggest thyme tea or hot bricks wrapped in cloth for creaky limbs, but when it came to intimacy, advice was limited. Pray for moderation was a common tip. So was avoid cold rooms and strong cheese. You try not to take that one personally. And then there were the social shifts. An older man pursuing a younger woman? Somewhat acceptable, provided he had land. An older woman pursuing a younger man? Scandalous. She might be accused of witchcraft. No, really. Witchy seduction was a popular theory when logic failed. Historians still argue whether these accusations were really about power, jealousy, or just badly timed crushes. But the result was the same. Older women had to walk carefully if they dared show affection again, as so many didn't. Not because they lacked desire, but because society didn't offer a space for it. Instead, they poured themselves into community life, became matchmakers, healers, secret keepers, and maybe, just maybe, quiet flirts when no one was looking. While you pause now, imagining yourself by the hearth, a second mug of ale warming your hands, a familiar voice beside you telling the same joke you've heard a dozen times. You laugh anyway, because here's the truth. In Tudor England, love didn't die after youth. It just went underground. It tucked itself into shared chores, into matching walking sticks, into the way your partner remembered how you like your eggs, overboiled, with just a pinch of salt and sometimes, against all odds, even in a world built to fear passion. That old ember flickered to life again while you pass a widow now, shawl drawn tight, humming softly. A song about May Day. It's slower than the young singing, but warmer. Too, and you realize the heart may wrinkle, but it never retires. Not in this life. Not in Tudor times. Not even beneath layers of linen, suspicion, and sage tea. You made it. Through the grime, the gossip, the codpieces, the courtship customs, and yes, even the turnip poetry. NOW. As the streets empty and the candlelight flickers out one by one, the noise of Tudor life begins to soften. The clang of market bells fades. The roosters settle. Even the alehouse bard has finally lost his voice while you lie back on your straw-stuffed mattress, the rough linen sheet scratchy, but oddly comforting. Outside your window, you hear the wind moving gently through timber beams, brushing the thatch with soft rhythm. It almost sounds like a lullaby. The fire has dwindled to coals. There's a mug, empty now, still warm from your last sip. You stretch, fingers brushing the air where a cat might curl, and close your eyes as the night folds around by you. And this world, love might be tricky. It might be secretive. It might involve questionable herbs, complicated laws, and an alarming number of witnesses. But it's still there. It lingers like spice in stew. A comfort, a spark, a joke whispered behind a laundry line. So rest now. Let the echoes of Tudor heartbeats lull you. The stories drift, their sharp corners smoothed by time. Let yourself soften. Tomorrow, perhaps you'll visit the apothecary again. Or flirt with that baker who always gives you the nicer crust. But tonight, you're safe, you're warm, and you've survived a world where love was anything but easy. But always worth the risk. Sleep well.